going on, you guys? Today I wanted to talk a little bit about landrace genetics, or basically things that you guys probably were familiar with if you began consuming hemp or cannabis way back when it kind of hit the mainstream back in like the 60s, 70s, 80s, etc. Landrace strains were basically the only thing that we really had access to, unless there were people who were, messing around with growing, which I'm sure there probably was, but it was pretty infrequent. So a landrace strain is something that only grows within a specific region, and it's specific to that environment and climate. So as soon as you take that strain, so say you were to take a very common and well-known strain, Hindu Kush, that is a landrace strain. It grows within the Hindu Kush mountains, so like Afghanistan and those countries. And it's really cold there. It's really, really cold. And Hindu Kush is able to grow in that region because it's used to it. It's just the land race that it's, that there's something called terroir. Terroir is basically all of the factors that go into the soil. So you've got like the climate, you've got the animals and insects in the region. You've got all of these things go into what makes up terroir. And then terroir is important because this is how the plant is going to grow based on the environment that it's in. But all of these landrace strains adapt to their environment. So if you get a really, a strain that's used to growing in the cold, it's gonna adapt and basically evolve based on the environment that it's in. So it's gonna have different terpenes because it's growing in a cold environment. It's going to have different effects because it's growing in a cold environment. Now, what makes this different and why we're even really talking about this is because landrace strains are really infrequent. Nowadays, everybody's kind of just finding the genetics that they want to grow and they grow it. And a lot of the time, these genetics have been, crossed with other strains time and time again, because you're taking these landrace strains and you're pulling them way out of the countries and regions that they are used to growing in. And when you grow it in a completely different environment, in a completely different region, in a completely different terroir, it's gonna have different effects, kind of like we talked on earlier. So if you're taking a strain that's used to growing in the cold out of that cold environment, and then you put it into an environment that is warmer, it's gonna have probably a different flavor, a different effect, a different appearance even.
Hey, you guys, so to break this down even further, terroir is actually a wine term, or I believe it is a wine term. So this is actually an example from a wine business or company, so that they made this chart. I can't take credit. But here are some examples and specific details as to what makes terroir so important and what makes terroir. All right, diving back into it.
So that's why it's important to understand these landrace strains. It's even more important to understand the genetics and like the parent genetics and how it was grown and the environment it was grown. What was it, indoor grown, was it out, sun grown? All of these things have an impact on the plant itself. But even more important is that people who might not be familiar with specific genetics or just kind of how strains work nowadays, like everything is bred very differently. So it's important to kind of like where you go and walk into a dispensary and you see something that's named like it's got Kush in the name, right? Because a lot of strains have Kush in the name. A lot of strains have gelato in the name, but there's several different kinds of gelato. There's several different kinds of Kush, because there's several different ways that it's been grown and it's been crossed with several different kinds of different genetics. So it's not going to be the same Kush most likely that you're familiar with. It's not going to be the same gelato most likely that you have experience with in the past.
So here we have another chart to kind of help explain what we were just talking about. As you see with the F1 generation, BC1 generation here, we're kind of seeing the generations unfold and unravel and expand into different versions of themselves as they're crossed with different strains. So as one strain is crossed with another, it's turning into a different version of itself. So that's why it's so important that when you try a new strain, you look at the history of the parent genetics and the overall, strains that it was crossed with, so you have a much better idea of the effects and the flavor profile before you try it.
So it's really important that you familiarize yourself with the strain that you intend to consume. Ask as many questions as possible, you know, especially if you know the person that's growing it. Yeah, I mean, you know, just the more that you can understand about how it was grown, the genetics, overall the terpenes, and of course the cannabinoids, the more of a coherent experience you're probably going to have, the more of a better idea of what the experience is going to be like before you consume this cannabis, whatever it may be. So yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. Landrace strains are not as frequently talked about as they used to be. Things like Durban Poison, Hindu Kush, which I believe we used as an example earlier. I think Trainwreck might be one. Don't quote me on it, but like these OG strains that we're all kind of familiar with, it's hard to find. They're hard to find. And if you do see these kind of names within the cannabis industry, they're probably not the original landrace strains. They're probably been crossed with something. They probably are a different phenotype, which we didn't really get into in this video, but I probably will talk more about this kind of stuff in the future. Probably talk more about, you know, genetics and landrace and the different phenotypes and all that fun stuff. So we'll probably dive more into that, but I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about that and yeah, just kind of see what you guys thought about it. See what your guys' experience with strains, and you know, maybe you guys have more experience with like cannabis nowadays, or maybe you have more experience with cannabis back when it was primarily landrace strains, you know? So you'll have to let me know what your experiences are, what you guys think about how hemp and cannabis has kind of changed, and whether you like it or not. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you guys for talking with me, for being here and hanging out. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.